before the funeral flowers had even started to wilt. My son-in-law. Daniel told me my wife's memory was bad for the property value. He didn't say it with malice. That was the most chilling part. He said it with the calm, detached authority of a financial advisor discussing a poorly performing stock. He stood in the center of our living room, the one Amelia had filled with light and laughter for 45 years, and his gaze swept over her paintings on the wall. They were gentle landscapes, studies of the flowers from her garden, impressions of light on water. To me, they were the wallpaper of my life. To Daniel, they were liabilities. "We'll need to get these down," he said, adjusting the cuff of his perfectly tailored suit. "A potential buyer wants to see clean lines, a blank canvas, you might say." The irony was lost on him. He was looking at a room full of canvases and couldn't see a single thing. That was 2 weeks after we buried her. 2 weeks of waking up to a house that had forgotten how to breathe. The silence was the first thing you noticed. It was an active physical presence that pressed in from all sides. When Amelia was alive, the house was a symphony of small sounds. The soft scratch of her charcoal pencils on paper, her off-key humming as she worked in the garden, the gentle clink of her teacup against its saucer. Now the only sound was the mournful tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting out the seconds of her absence. Each tick was a small, sharp reminder that time was moving on, even though my world had stopped. I found myself wandering through the rooms like a ghost, touching the things she had touched. Her favorite armchair by the window still held the faint impression of her body. Her reading glasses were on the side table, folded neatly beside a book she would never finish. I couldn't bring myself to move them. Moving them would be an admission that she was truly gone, that she wasn't just in the next room about to call out my name. My own reflection in the hallway mirror was a stranger. A 72-year-old man with hollowed-out eyes and a stoop in his shoulders I didn't recognize. Grief was a poor tailor. It had taken my old life and refitted it into something that hung loose and unfamiliar. My daughter Elena and her husband Daniel had appointed themselves the managers of my sorrow. They visited every other day, bringing casseroles that tasted like obligation and advice that felt like a verdict. Elena, my sweet, gentle Elena, was lost. Her own grief was a storm she couldn't navigate, and she clung to Daniel's confident pronouncements like a life raft. She truly believed he was trying to help, that his cold logic was a form of protection. She couldn't see the calculator clicking away behind his concerned eyes. That afternoon, they arrived for another of their check-ins. Elena carried a pot of soup, her face a pale mask of exhaustion. Daniel carried his leather briefcase, his mind already on the next agenda item. He sat across from me at the kitchen table while Elena bustled about putting the soup in the refrigerator, her movements a nervous flutter. "Dad, we need to talk about the practical matters," Daniel began, opening his briefcase. He spoke in a tone one might use with a child, patient but firm. "I've been running some numbers. The upkeep on this house, the property taxes, the utilities. It's a significant financial drain, especially for one person." He slid a neatly printed spreadsheet across the table. It was a budget, a cost analysis of my own life. "We're very worried about you," he continued, pointing to a column of figures. "You shouldn't have to carry this burden alone." It was then he gestured toward the living room, toward Amelia's paintings. "For example, all of this art. It's sentimental, I understand that, but it's not an asset. In fact, a professional stager would tell you it's a detriment. It makes the house feel dated, personal. We need to depersonalize the space to maximize its market potential." Elena came back to the table, her hands twisting a dish towel. "Daniel, please, not now." He reached over and patted her hand condescendingly. "Honey, now is exactly the time. Your father is in a vulnerable position. It's our responsibility to make smart, logical decisions for him. We can't let sentiment cloud our judgment." He looked at me again, his eyes clear and direct. "We've already spoken to a realtor. The market in this neighborhood is at an all-time high. Selling now would set you up for life, Dad. A beautiful modern condo. No maintenance, no worries. All your assets managed professionally by me, of course. It's the sensible thing to do." I didn't say anything. I just stared at the spreadsheet, at the cold, hard numbers he had used to quantify my existence. He saw my silence not as shock or anger, but as confusion. He saw the grief-stricken old man he wanted me to be. After they left, I walked out to the old converted garage at the back of the garden. Amelia's studio. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting smell of turpentine and linseed oil. Canvases in various stages of completion were everywhere. Some were stacked against the walls, Others sat on easels, still waiting for a final touch that would never come. This was her world, the one place she was completely unapologetically herself. The place Daniel saw as a worthless shed to be demolished. I sat down on her paint-splattered stool, the silence of the studio a different kind than the silence in the house. This was a peaceful quiet, a creative quiet. I ran my hand over a stack of her old journals, and a memory surfaced as sharp and clear as the day it happened. It was a few years ago. Daniel had just made some offhand dismissive comment about her little hobby. Later that evening, after he and Elena had gone home, I found Amelia here in her studio quietly cleaning her brushes. She wasn't upset. She had a strange, knowing little smile on her face. I had asked her if his words bothered her. She had looked up at me, her eyes twinkling in the dim light. "Don't you worry about him, James," she had whispered, taking my hand. "He sees the world in dollars and cents. He can't help it. But you and I, we know better." She squeezed my hand, her gaze turning serious. "You listen to me. One day these little paintings are going to take care of you. Promise me you'll remember that." I had promised, of course, though I thought it was just her way of comforting herself. It was just a sweet, fanciful notion. But sitting there now, surrounded by the silent, vibrant evidence of her soul, her words no longer felt like a fantasy. They felt like a battle plan. The first sign that Daniel's concern was not a kindness but a campaign came on a Tuesday morning at the grocery store. It was the first time I had gone since the funeral, and the fluorescent brightness of the aisles felt like an assault. I found myself moving on autopilot, my hand reaching for the things Amelia had always loved. The Earl Grey tea she drank every morning, the dark chocolate with sea salt she kept hidden in her bedside table, the rosemary crackers she claimed were the perfect companion to a glass of wine. My cart was a collection of small, heartbreaking habits. Standing in the checkout line, I felt a profound sense of foolishness, a widower buying groceries for a ghost. When my turn came, I swiped my credit card, the one we had used for 20 years. The machine beeped a flat negative sound. Declined. The young cashier looked at me with an expression of practiced pity. "Do you want to try that again, sir?" she asked. I did. It was declined again. A flush of heat crept up my neck. The woman behind me sighed impatiently. Fumbling in my wallet, I pulled out my debit card. Declined. It was an impossible public humiliation. I left the cart full of Amelia's favorite things sitting there and walked out of the store, the cashier's sympathetic, "I'm sorry, sir," following me into the parking lot. Back home, my hands were trembling as I opened my laptop. My email inbox was flooded with alerts from the bank. Suspicious activity on your account. Security profile updated. Action required. Please verify your identity. I clicked the link, which led me to a labyrinth of security questions. What was your mother's favorite flower? What was the name of your first dog? I typed in the answers that had been the same for decades. Rose, Buddy. Each time the screen flashed red, information does not match our records. After the third failed attempt, my online access was locked. I called the bank's customer service line, my frustration mounting. The polite but firm voice on the other end of the phone was no help. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter, but you are failing the security verification. I cannot grant you access to the account." I explained that I had been the primary account holder for 50 years. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice a smooth, unhelpful recording. "But our records show that a secondary authorized user, a Mr. Daniel Miller, updated the security profile yesterday for your protection. Perhaps you could ask him for the new information, my protection." The phrase landed like a stone in my gut. I hung up the phone and immediately called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, his voice a perfect imitation of relief and concern. "Dad, thank goodness you called. I was just about to phone you. I didn't want to worry you, but I noticed some strange pings on your accounts last night looked like they were coming from Eastern Europe. I was so afraid you were being targeted by scammers. You know how they go after seniors." His explanation was a smooth, plausible river of lies. I took the liberty of adding a new state-of-the-art security layer to everything. I changed all the security questions to things only you and I would know. I was going to come over this evening and give you all the new passwords. I'm so sorry it caused you trouble at the store. I just wanted to make sure you were safe. I stood in my silent kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, feeling a cold dread seep into my bones. He had an answer for everything. An answer that painted him as the hero, the protector, and me as the vulnerable old man who needed protecting. Why didn't you tell me you were doing it, Daniel? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. There was a brief pause. Honestly, Dad, you've been through so much. I didn't want to add another worry to your plate. I was just trying to handle it for you. Let me come by tonight. We'll sort it all out. I agreed and hung up, but the feeling of unease lingered. His help felt less like a shield and more like a cage, one whose bars he was quietly, methodically putting into place. Over the next week, the cage grew tighter. Daniel's phone calls became a daily ritual, each one a subtle act of psychological warfare designed to make me doubt my own mind. Hey, Dad, just checking in. The power company sent an overdue notice to my email. Don't worry, I paid it for you. You must have misplaced the bill. I knew for a fact that I had paid that bill. I had the confirmation email to prove it, but his confident assertion made me second-guess myself. Had I paid it? Was I becoming that forgetful? Another day, it was about insurance. Dad, I was reviewing the homeowner's policy and it looks like it's about to lapse. It's really important we get that renewed. Do you remember where you keep the original documents? I had renewed the policy 6 months ago. The documents were in the top drawer of my filing cabinet where they had been for 30 years. But his questions were like small drops of acid, slowly eroding my confidence. He was building a case, not with facts, but with the insidious power of suggestion. He was creating a version of me that was confused, incompetent, and in desperate need of his expert management. The most painful blow, however, was delivered by my own daughter. Elena arrived on a Friday afternoon alone. She looked pale, and her eyes were red as if she had been crying for hours. She carried a large leather portfolio that I knew belonged to Daniel. She avoided my gaze as she sat at the kitchen table, placing the portfolio between us like a barrier. Dad, she began, her voice trembling. Please don't be angry. Daniel and we're just so worried. She opened the portfolio and slid a thick sheaf of papers toward me. The title at the top was printed in a cold, bold font, Temporary Financial Power of Attorney. My heart went still. What is this, Elena? I asked, though I already knew. Tears began to spill down her cheeks. It's just a formality. Daniel had his lawyer draw it up. It's just so he can help you, to pay the bills and manage the investments and everything, just for a little while, just until you're feeling stronger. She was reciting a script, a speech her husband had coached her to deliver. He says it's the only way to really protect you, to make sure no one takes advantage of you while you're grieving. I looked at my daughter, at the raw pain and confusion on her face, and I wasn't angry. I was heartbroken. She was his most effective weapon, a tool sharpened by love and fear. I reached across the table and took her hands. They were ice cold. Elena, look at me. She slowly lifted her tear-filled eyes to mine. Have I ever in your entire life been irresponsible with money? Have I ever failed to provide for this family? No, but your mother and I started with nothing. I said, my voice gentle but firm. I worked 2 jobs while she raised you. I built this house with my own hands. I managed every dollar that came in and out of this family for 50 years. Grief is a heavy burden, sweetheart. It's the heaviest I've ever known. But it does not make me a child. It does not erase my ability to think, to remember, to manage my own life. I pushed the papers slowly back toward her. I am not signing this. This document isn't about protecting me. It's about controlling me. And your husband should know better than to send you here to do his dirty work. A fresh wave of sobs shook her. I don't know what to do, she whispered. He makes it all sound so logical, so reasonable. Logic without love is just calculation, Elena, and your husband is very good at calculating. She left a few minutes later, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She couldn't bring herself to say goodbye, just a choked, miserable whisper of, I'm sorry, before she fled to her car. I watched her drive away, feeling more alone than I had at Amelia's funeral. Daniel had found a way to stand between me and my own child, to poison the one relationship I thought was unconditional. I knew my refusal was not the end of the matter. For Daniel, it was just the beginning. It was the justification he needed for his next, more brutal attack. The silence from them lasted for 3 days. It was a heavy, watchful quiet. I knew they were planning something. I could feel it in the air. My refusal to sign the power of attorney was not a victory. It was a trigger. I had given Daniel the exact proof he needed to escalate his campaign. I was the stubborn, irrational old man who was refusing help. On the 4th day, the mail arrived. Tucked between the usual collection of catalogs and bills was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It had the embossed letterhead of a law firm in the city, one I had never heard of. My hands felt cold as I slid it open with a kitchen knife. The paper inside was heavy, expensive. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the message was brutally clear. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table to read it. It was a formal proposal, a legal recommendation. In light of your recent refusal to accept familial assistance with your financial affairs, it began, and in consideration of the significant emotional distress you are currently experiencing, a state which can often impair judgment and decision-making capabilities. Every word was a carefully chosen weapon. Every phrase was designed to paint me as a man unmoored by grief, a danger to his own financial well-being. Then came the final devastating paragraph. Therefore, to safeguard the integrity of the Carter family estate and to provide you with the professional support you require during this difficult transition, we formally propose the establishment of a voluntary conservatorship to be managed by your daughter, Elena Miller, and your son-in-law, Mr. Daniel Miller. This legal structure will relieve you of the burdens of asset management and ensure that your best interests are protected by those who care for you most. Conservatorship. The word landed with the force of a physical blow. It was a legal term for an erasure. They wanted to have me declared incompetent. They wanted to strip me of my rights, my autonomy, my very identity as a capable adult. My home, my savings, my life's work, all of it would be handed over to the control of the man who saw my wife's soul as clutter. My refusal to sign Elena's papers had been twisted into the central piece of evidence against me. It was no longer a father defending his independence. It was now proof of my impaired judgment. I held the letter in my hand, the heavy paper trembling. This was not a panicked overreaction from a worried son-in-law. This was a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly brilliant move. It was a declaration of war. I looked out the window, my gaze falling on the old garage at the end of the garden, Amelia's studio. The storm was no longer a distant threat on the horizon. It had broken, and it was right on top of me, and I was utterly, completely alone. The letter sat on my kitchen table, a silent, malevolent presence. Conservatorship. The word itself felt like a judgment, a final heavy door slamming shut on my life. I read the sentences over and over, but the words refused to soften. Impaired judgment, emotional distress, best interests. They were Daniel's words, dressed up in the cold, unassailable armor of the law. He had taken my grief, the most private and sacred part of me, and twisted it into a weapon to be used against me. My first instinct was a hot, blinding flash of rage. I wanted to call him, to scream at him, to demand he face me and say these things to my face. But then, as the anger subsided, a deeper, colder feeling took its place. Fear. A profound and chilling fear I hadn't felt since Amelia's diagnosis. He could do this. In a world of spreadsheets and legal documents, a world that trusted the confident pronouncements of a successful young man over the quiet dignity of a grieving old one, he could actually win. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call Elena. I called the only person I could trust, my own lawyer, a man named George Henderson, who had handled our family's affairs for 40 years. He was a man from another time, a man who believed in handshakes and whose word was his bond. His voice on the other end of the line was a calm, steady anchor in my swirling panic. "James, what's wrong? You sound terrible." I read him the letter, my own voice, a stranger's cracking over the cruel legalistic phrases. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "The boy has some nerve," George said finally, his voice a low, angry rumble. "This is a gross overreach, James. A disgusting abuse of the process. We'll fight it. We'll get affidavits from your doctor, from your friends. We'll prove you are as competent as you've ever been." His confidence was a small comfort, but I knew Daniel was not a man who entered a battle unprepared. He had planned for this. "He's been building a case, George," I said, my voice heavy. "Calling me, asking questions, making me doubt my own memory. He's been laying a foundation of lies." "Then we'll tear it down brick by brick," George said with a fierce loyalty that warmed my cold heart. "Don't you worry. I'll file a response first thing in the morning. We'll shut this down before it even gets started." But Daniel was faster. He was a creature of the modern world, a world that moved at the speed of light while George and I were still operating on the steady, reliable rhythm of the past. Before George could even draft his response, the second blow landed. It came not in the form of a letter, but a phone call from George himself, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence, replaced by a tone of shocked disbelief. "James, he's filed an emergency petition with the court." Daniel had gone to a judge armed with a portfolio of manufactured evidence. He presented recorded snippets of our phone calls, cleverly edited to make me sound confused and forgetful. He submitted copies of the overdue bills he himself had paid, presented as proof of my financial negligence. He even had a sworn affidavit from a new neighbor, a young couple who had moved in down the road, stating that they had seen me wandering in my garden late at night looking disoriented and lost. It was a masterpiece of deceit, a carefully constructed narrative of my supposed decline. And the court, faced with this pile of evidence and the seemingly heartfelt plea of a concerned son-in-law, did exactly what Daniel knew they would do. They acted in my best interest. "The judge has issued a temporary asset freeze," George explained, his voice tight with frustration. "It's a standard precautionary measure, James. They're not saying you're incompetent. They're just putting everything on hold to protect the estate until a formal hearing can be scheduled. All your main accounts, the brokerage, the savings, they're all frozen." Frozen. The word was so simple, so clinical. It didn't begin to describe the brutal reality of what had just happened. After I hung up with George, I sat in Amelia's armchair for a long time, the silence of the house a crushing weight. The world outside the window continued on as if nothing had happened. A blue jay squawked from a pine branch. A car drove past on the road. But inside, my world had been brought to a complete and total standstill. I was a prisoner in my own life, my ability to function held hostage by my son-in-law's ambition. The true visceral impact of it didn't hit me until later that afternoon. I needed to pick up a prescription from the pharmacy, and I realized my wallet was nearly empty. It didn't matter. I had a checking account with thousands of dollars in it. I drove to the bank, the same bank where Amelia and I had opened our first account as a married couple, the bank where every teller knew me by name. I walked up to the counter and slid my withdrawal slip to a young woman I didn't recognize. She smiled politely, typed my information into her computer, and then her smile faltered. She frowned, typed again, and then looked up at me with an expression of professional regret. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice a low murmur. "But there appears to be a hold on this account, a legal injunction. I'm afraid I can't process this withdrawal." I just stood there staring at her, the withdrawal slip still sitting on the counter between us. People in line behind me were shifting, murmuring. The polite, orderly world of the bank lobby suddenly felt like a hostile alien landscape. I was no longer James Carter, longtime customer. I was a problem, a man who couldn't access his own money. I mumbled something, an apology or an explanation, I don't remember which, and walked out of the bank. The afternoon sun was bright, but I felt a profound, deep-seated chill. It was real. This wasn't just a legal battle fought with papers and lawyers. This was my life. And I had just been completely and utterly cut off. I had been financially executed. I didn't have to wait long. They came that evening just as the sun was setting, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the lawn. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway and looked out the window to see Daniel's sleek black SUV. It moved with the silent, predatory grace of a shark. This time there was no pretense of a social call. There was no pot of soup, no forced, sad smiles. Daniel got out of the driver's side, his movements sharp and purposeful. Elena emerged from the passenger side like someone being led to her own execution. Her face was pale, and she refused to look toward the house, her gaze fixed on the ground, as if she might find an escape route there. I met them at the door. I would not let them invade this house while I cowered in a chair. This was still my home, and I would face them on my own 2 feet. Daniel brushed past me without a word of greeting, his expensive cologne a foul chemical intrusion in the quiet air of my home. He walked directly to the coffee table and placed a thick, official-looking document on its surface. The crisp sound of the paper hitting the wood was like the crack of a whip. Elena followed him, a silent, miserable shadow. She would not look at me. She could not. To look at me would be to acknowledge what she was doing, and she was not strong enough for that. "You see, Dad," Daniel said. He didn't call me James. He called me Dad, twisting the word into an instrument of condescension. He gestured to the court order. "The judge agrees with me. The court can see that you are not in a position to manage your own affairs. This isn't me saying it anymore. This is the law. This is for your own good." His voice was utterly devoid of emotion. He was a machine executing a program, and my pain was an irrelevant variable in his calculation. I ignored him. His cruelty was a known quantity, a dry, sterile thing. The real wound, the one that was bleeding me dry, was my daughter's betrayal. I turned to her. She was standing by the fireplace, staring at the family photos on the mantel, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She was looking at a picture of herself as a little girl sitting on my shoulders at a county fair, both of us laughing with a joy so pure it was painful to remember. "Elena," I said, my voice soft. I was pleading with her, trying to find a crack in the wall her husband had built around her heart. "Is this what you believe? Do you really think I need this?" I pointed to the court order on the table. "Do you think this is what your mother would have wanted?" That was a mistake. Mentioning her mother broke what little composure she had left. A choked sob escaped her lips. She finally turned to me, her face a mess of tears and shame. I don't know what to think anymore," she whispered, her voice ragged. "He makes everything sound so right, so logical. I just want you to be safe, Dad. I just want you to be taken care of." Safe. The word came out laced with a bitterness that surprised even me. I took a step toward her. "Safe in a cage your husband built for me. Is that what safety looks like to you, Elena? A life where I have no say, no freedom, no dignity. A life where every decision is made for me by a man who thinks your mother's entire soul is just clutter to be cleared away for a better asking price." She flinched as if I had struck her. She had no answer. She just stood there weeping, a puppet whose strings were tangled. Daniel stepped between us, literally placing his body between me and my daughter. He put a comforting hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was both possessive and dismissive. "Enough of this," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the emotional chaos. "The time for sentimental debate is over. The court has made its decision. Now we move on to the practical logistics." He turned his full attention to me, his eyes cold and hard. He had won, and he was now simply dictating the terms of my surrender. "Here is what is going to happen," he said, his voice the calm, clear tone of a CEO laying out a corporate strategy. "First, you will be moving into the Oakwood Residences downtown. It's a top-of-the-line luxury service department. 5-star amenities, 24-hour staff medical services on call. All your needs will be met. I've already put down a deposit for the first 3 months." He made it sound like a generous gift, a reward, not a prison. "Second, this house and the surrounding property will be listed for sale effective immediately. I have already retained the services of the best real estate agent in the state. She will be here tomorrow to begin staging." He paused, letting the finality of his words sink in. "The proceeds from the sale will be placed into a new professionally managed trust account. A generous portion will be allocated to cover your living expenses at Oakwood for the remainder of your life. The rest," he said, and for the first time a faint triumphant gleam appeared in his eyes, "will be invested aggressively to ensure the long-term growth and security of this family's assets. It's the only responsible way forward." He walked to the door, pulling Elena gently along with him. At the threshold, he turned back, his gaze sweeping over the living room, over Amelia's paintings, over me, with the detached look of a man who had just closed a successful but slightly distasteful business deal. "We'll have movers here on Thursday morning at 9, he said. "You should probably start packing your personal things. And Dad," he added, his voice dropping slightly, a final casual twist of the knife, "try not to take too much. The apartment isn't nearly as large, and we really need the house to show well." Then they were gone. The front door clicked shut, and I was alone again in the crushing silence. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the echo of his final words ringing in my ears. Pack my life into a few small boxes. Make sure the house, my home, was neat and tidy for the strangers who would come to pick over its bones. My grief for Amelia was a vast, deep ocean, but what I felt in that moment was something new. It was the cold, hard realization that I had not just lost my wife. I had lost my son-in-law. I had lost my daughter, and now I was about to lose everything else. The next morning I woke before dawn. I did not want the day to begin. I walked through the silent sleeping house one last time, my hand trailing along the walls, the furniture, the door frames. It was a final, silent farewell. Each object I touched was a repository of a shared memory, a small piece of the life Amelia and I had built together. I stood in the doorway of Elena's childhood room, remembering the sound of her small voice reading stories aloud. I paused in the living room, my gaze resting on the faint scuff marks on the floor where a 5-year-old Daniel had crashed his toy truck into the wall. This house was not a building. It was a living archive of our love, our joy, our failures, and our history. And today it was going to be sterilized. At precisely 9 o'clock, a large, impersonal moving truck rumbled up the driveway, its diesel engine shattering the morning quiet. It was a brutal, mechanical intrusion. The doors opened and 3 men in identical blue uniforms got out. They moved with a practiced, detached efficiency, their faces impassive. They were not villains. They were just men doing a job. That somehow made it worse. Their professional indifference was a reflection of Daniel's own. To them, this was not a home being dismantled. It was just another job site. Daniel was already there, directing them from the porch with a clipboard in his hand. He was in his element, a project manager, overseeing the liquidation of an asset. He didn't look at me as I stepped outside. He was focused on the task at hand, his voice sharp and clear. The large furniture first. Wrap everything in plastic. I want no scratches, no damage. These pieces are going to a high-end consignment store. I stood on the lawn and watched as my life was carried out the front door and loaded onto the truck. They wrapped Amelia's favorite armchair in thick, suffocating plastic, its floral pattern disappearing under a clinical sheen. They took down the family photographs from the mantel, each smiling face a ghost from a life that no longer existed. They emptied my bookshelves, the spines of the books I had read and loved disappearing into the brown anonymity of cardboard boxes. With each item that passed through the doorway, a piece of my heart was being methodically packed away and hauled off. I felt a scream building in my chest, a primal roar of protest and rage. I wanted to throw myself in front of the truck to fight them, to tell them that they were not just moving furniture, they were desecrating a sacred space. But then I heard her voice in my memory, as clear and as calm as if she were standing right beside me. "Don't argue, James. Don't fight them. This is not the battle." Her words were a lifeline. I clung to them, a silent mantra that kept my rage in check. I stood my ground on the lawn, a silent, immovable statue of grief, and I watched. My silence was not surrender. It was an act of faith, faith in her. After an hour, Daniel walked over to me, his eyes avoiding mine. "We've designated 4 boxes for your personal effects," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "Clothes, toiletries, medication, the essentials. The rest is going into a secure climate-controlled storage facility. We need the house completely empty for the stagers. It needs to look like a showroom, not a museum." He then glanced over at the old garage, Amelia's studio, with an expression of pure disdain. "That junk pile is next," he said, making a note on his clipboard. "I've got a disposal crew scheduled for Monday to clear it all out. It's an eyesore. There's nothing in there of any value." Nothing of any value. He had looked at the very core of my wife's soul and declared it worthless. I said nothing. I just nodded, my face a blank mask. My passivity seemed to annoy him. He had expected a fight, an emotional outburst from a grieving old man. My quiet compliance was something he hadn't planned for, and it threw him off balance. When the truck was finally loaded and the house stood empty, its rooms echoing with a hollow, profound emptiness, Daniel made his final move. He walked over to me, holding out a sleek, corporate-looking folder. "Here," he said. "This has the address and the key card for your new apartment, the Oakwood. It's all paid for. And this," he added, holding out a single sterile plastic card, "is a prepaid debit card with enough on it to cover your expenses for the first month, groceries, whatever. It's all taken care of." I looked at the folder in his hand. I looked at the prepaid card, a financial leash he was offering me. I looked at his face, so full of triumphant, self-righteous certainty. Then I turned my gaze to the studio, the last remaining outpost of my life, the last piece of her that he had not yet managed to touch. I did not take the folder. I did not take the card. "I will be staying here," I said, my voice quiet but as solid as the foundation of the house I had built. I gestured with my head toward the studio. Daniel stared at me, his mouth agape. For a moment he was genuinely speechless. Then a short, sharp bark of a laugh escaped his lips. It was a sound of pure, contemptuous disbelief. "Here," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. You want to live in that filthy shack with the mice and the spiders? He shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. Suit yourself, Dad. Be the tragic artist if you want. It doesn't matter to me. He tossed the folder onto the porch steps. The offer stands in case you come to your senses, but just so you know, he added, his voice hardening again, that shit is scheduled for demolition in 3 weeks, so don't get too comfortable. He turned without another word and got into his SUV. I heard the solid final click of the main house's new deadbolt turning as a security man he'd hired locked it up. The engine of the SUV started and he drove away, not even looking in his rearview mirror. I was alone. The house I had lived in for nearly 50 years was now a hollow, empty shell that no longer belonged to me. The moving truck was gone. My daughter was gone. My life was gone. All I had left was the small, dusty outbuilding at the end of the garden. I walked slowly across the lawn, my feet heavy each step in effort. I reached the old paint-flecked door of the studio and pushed it open. I stepped inside and closed it behind me, shutting out the empty house and the empty world. I sank down onto Amelia's old stool, surrounded by her canvases, her silent, colorful ghosts. And in the quiet, dusty air, I was finally crushed by the overwhelming weight of my failure, my loneliness, and my profound, absolute defeat. The first night in the studio was the longest of my life. The sun went down, and a profound, deep cold seeped up from the concrete floor, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of absolute loneliness. I found an old, threadbare wool blanket in the storage bin one Amelia used to cover her clay sculptures and wrapped it around my shoulders. I didn't try to sleep. Instead, I sat on her stool in the near darkness, the only light a pale silver beam of moonlight filtering through the dusty skylight. The studio, which Daniel had dismissed as a junk pile, was now my whole world. It was a strange, disorienting feeling. I was a refugee in my own backyard, a king exiled to the furthest, most neglected corner of his own kingdom. The air was thick with the ghosts of her creativity. The sharp, clean scent of turpentine, the earthy smell of clay, the sweet, familiar aroma of linseed oil. In the darkness, surrounded by these smells, I felt closer to her than I had in the cold, empty house. It was as if her essence, her very spirit, was woven into the fabric of this place. I began to move through the space, my hands trailing over the rough surfaces of her work tables, the smooth, cool metal of her easels. My fingers found the familiar shapes of her tools, the worn wooden handles of her brushes, the smooth, rounded edges of her palette knives. These were the instruments of her secret life, the tools she had used to build a world no one, not even me, had ever truly been allowed to enter. My eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, and the canvases around me began to emerge from the shadows. They were not just the gentle landscapes I had seen in the house. Here, in the privacy of her sanctuary, her work was different. It was bolder, more complex. I pulled a large canvas from a stack against the wall and propped it on an empty easel. It was a self-portrait, but not one I had ever seen before. It was Amelia, but seen through a storm of color. Her face was a landscape of raw emotion, her eyes a turbulent sea of blues and grays, her mouth a tight, defiant line of crimson. This was not the placid, gentle woman I had known. This was a warrior. A woman who had been fighting a silent private battle for years. I spent the rest of that long night looking at her work, really looking for the first time. I saw portraits of strangers whose faces were so full of life, so full of story, that I felt as if I knew them. I saw abstract paintings, chaotic swirls of color and texture that spoke of a deep inner turmoil of a passion and a rage I never knew she possessed. I saw landscapes that were not just pretty scenes, but emotional maps, the twist of a tree branch echoing a feeling of despair, the sudden burst of sunlight through a dark cloud, a symbol of a fragile, hard-won hope. I had lived with a genius for 45 years and had been completely, utterly blind to it. Daniel had called this clutter, but it was not clutter. It was a language, and for the first time, I was beginning to learn how to read it. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet discovery and grim survival. I found a small hot plate in a cupboard and a dented kettle, and I lived on instant coffee and the canned soup I had the foresight to grab from my truck. The nights were cold, the days were long and empty. The only thing that kept me going was the work of exploring my wife's world. To occupy my hands and my mind, I decided to bring some order to the creative chaos of her studio. It was a way of honoring her, of tending to the legacy that Daniel had so casually dismissed. I began to sort through the stacks of canvases, carefully dusting each one, cataloging them, trying to make sense of the sheer volume of her life's work. It was during this process that I found it. Tucked away under a dusty dropcloth in a dark corner was an old, sea-beaten wooden chest. It was the kind of thing a pirate might have used, bound with rusted iron straps and secured with a heavy, old-fashioned brass lock. I recognized it immediately. It was a chest that had belonged to Amelia's grandfather, a sea captain. I had always assumed it was empty, just another piece of sentimental family history she couldn't bear to part with. Curiosity piqued. I searched her work tables for a key, but found nothing. After a few minutes of fruitless searching, my old engineering mind kicked in. I found a small, sturdy piece of metal, a palette knife, and after several minutes of patient, careful work, I managed to jimmy the old lock. It sprang open with a rusty groan. I lifted the heavy lid, expecting to find old sailing maps or dusty trinkets, but the chest was filled with something else entirely. It was packed to the brim with dozens of small, leather-bound notebooks, each one meticulously labeled with a year. They were not diaries. I opened the first one. The pages were filled with Amelia's neat, elegant script, but the entries were not personal reflections. They were technical, precise. Each entry corresponded to a specific painting. She had noted the date it was started and finished, the specific mixture of pigments she had used, the type of canvas, even her inspirations, a line of poetry, a piece of music, a memory. And at the end of each entry was a long, complex string of letters and numbers. It was a code. My heart began to pound. This was not the work of a hobbyist. This was the meticulous archive of a professional artist. I dug deeper into the chest, my hands trembling. Beneath the notebooks at the very bottom was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a simple wax stamp bearing the initial A, and on the front, in her beautiful, familiar handwriting, was my name, James. My breath caught in my throat. I sat down on the dusty floor, the envelope heavy in my hands. It felt like a final communication from another world. With fumbling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest James," it began. "If you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and my heart aches for the battle I have left you to fight alone. Please, my love, do not despair, and do not waste your anger on them. They are not the enemy. They are just blind, and you cannot fight blindness with rage. You must fight it with light." Tears blurred the words, and I had to stop to wipe my eyes. I know that Daniel sees my art as worthless clutter. I have always known this. In a way, his blindness was my greatest protection. It allowed me to work, to create, to build a fortress for us right under his nose, and he was too busy counting his imaginary coins to ever notice. For the past 10 years, my love, I have not been a hobbyist. I have been working with a man named Jean-Pierre Dubois, an art dealer in Paris. He has been selling my work under the pseudonym Aria to a small private circle of international collectors. They know my value, and now the world will too. This chest contains the key to everything. These notebooks are the official provenance for my entire collection. The codes at the end of each entry are the authentication keys. Without them, the paintings are just beautiful objects. With them, they are an undeniable, legally binding legacy. Our legacy. I have left you one final tool. In this chest, you will find an old cell phone. It is not connected to any of our accounts. It is a private, untraceable line. Mr. Dubois's contact information is with it. Call him. Tell him you are the husband of Aria. And then, James, you must do the hardest thing of all. You must trust him completely. Do exactly as he says. He is a good man, and he was my loyal friend. He will guide you through the final steps of the plan I have laid out. This is my last move for us, my love. For both of us. I folded the letter, my mind reeling. A secret life, a secret identity, a secret fortune. It was the plot of a novel, not my life. I reached back into the chest and found the small, old model cell phone tucked into a side pocket with a single, elegant business card. Jean-Pierre Dubois, Art Consultant, Paris. I took a deep, shuddering breath, a mixture of terror and a strange, exhilarating hope flooding through me. My wife had not left me defenseless. She had left me an arsenal. I walked out of the studio and into the chilly afternoon air. The world looked different. The trees seemed sharper, the sky a deeper, more vibrant blue. I stood there for a moment, the old phone feeling strange and heavy in my hand. Then I dialed the international number. The phone rang 3 times, and then a calm, professional voice with a distinct French accent answered. Dubois. My voice was a dry, cracking whisper. My name is James Carter, I said. I was the husband of Amelia Carter, the artist you know as Aria. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The voice that came back was cautious, professional, guarded. I am sorry for your loss, monsieur, but I think you may be mistaken. I do not know anyone by that name. She told me to call you, I said, my voice gaining strength. She told me to give you a code. I opened one of the notebooks and read out the first alphanumeric string I saw. The change in the man's tone was instantaneous. The professional caution evaporated, replaced by a wave of warmth and genuine emotion. Monsieur Carter, he said, his voice now filled with a profound respect. Please accept my deepest, most sincere apologies, and my deepest condolences. I have been waiting for your call. Your wife was a genius, a true master, and she is prepared for this moment with the precision of a general planning a great battle. Please do not worry. From this moment on, we will handle everything. You are no longer alone. My days in the studio followed a quiet, steady rhythm. I was living on the fringes of my own life, a ghost in my own garden. But for the first time since Amelia's death, I did not feel powerless. I had a secret, a beautiful, powerful secret that was quietly gathering strength in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. I spoke with Monsieur Dubois every evening on the small, untraceable phone Amelia had left me. His voice, calm and assured, became my lifeline across the ocean. He instructed me with the precision of a master strategist. Patience, Monsieur Carter, he would say. Let him make his move. Let him reveal his hand. The man who acts first in a game of this nature is often the man who loses. And so, I waited. I tended to Amelia's garden, the familiar work of pulling weeds and watering roses, a kind of meditation. I organized her studio, carefully cataloging each canvas against the notebooks from the chest, a quiet, solemn conversation with my wife's legacy. I was a soldier preparing his defenses, polishing his armor, waiting for the inevitable assault. It came a week later. Daniel, confident that he had won, decided it was time to liquidate the assets. He was done with the pretense of managing my affairs for my own good. It was time to cash in. He called me on the house landline, which I had managed to get reconnected, his voice dripping with false concern. Dad, I've arranged for an appraiser to come by tomorrow morning, a local fellow, very reputable. He's just going to do a quick inventory of the house contents for insurance purposes. You know, a formality. I knew it was a lie. He was getting a valuation, the first step in emptying the house and putting it on the market. Of course, Daniel, I said, my voice as mild and cooperative as I could manage. Whatever you think is best. My compliance seemed to please him. He saw the defeated old man he needed me to be. The next morning, a man named Henderson arrived in a dusty sedan. He was a small, nervous man with a clipboard and a weary air about him, the kind of man who has spent his life assigning dollar values to other people's memories. Daniel was already there, playing the role of the lord of the manor. Elena was with him. She stood by the window in the living room, her arms wrapped around herself, her face a portrait of misery. She looked like a prisoner attending the execution of a dear friend. Daniel led Henderson on a tour of the house, pointing out the furniture, the silver, the antiques. Henderson made notes on his clipboard, his voice a low, unenthusiastic drone. Antique sideboard, fair condition, maybe $1,200. Set of china, probably $800. He moved through the rooms with a bored efficiency, reducing our life together to a list of depreciating assets. Then they came to the studio. Daniel pushed open the door with a theatrical sigh. And then there's all this, he said, waving a dismissive hand at the hundreds of canvases. My mother-in-law's hobby. I doubt any of it's worth much, but you should probably take a look for the record. Henderson stepped inside, his expression souring as he took in the creative chaos. He picked up a small, vibrant painting of a sunflower, a piece so full of light it seemed to generate its own. He turned it over, squinted at the back, and set it down with a thud. Yeah, this is amateur stuff, he said with the unearned confidence of a man who knows very little. The brushwork is undisciplined, the colors are a bit garish. You might get $100 for it at a local flea market, if you're lucky. He moved on to another, the powerful self-portrait of Amelia I had discovered. He barely glanced at it. This one's very dark, unsettling, probably $50. Honestly, Mr. Miller, you'd spend more on the frames than you'd make from the art. Your best bet is to sell them as a lot, maybe a few hundred for everything, to someone who wants to paint over the canvases." Daniel nodded, a smug, satisfied look on his face. This confirmed his own judgment. He had been right all along. It was all just worthless clutter. Elena, who had followed them to the studio doorway, let out a small, pained whimper. I, who had been sitting quietly on Amelia's stool in the corner, remained silent. I was following my general's orders. I was letting him reveal his hand. It was in that moment, in the middle of Henderson's dismissive pronouncement, that a long, black limousine pulled silently up the gravel driveway. It was a vehicle of such profound, understated elegance that it seemed to have arrived from another planet. The dusty sedan of the local appraiser looked like a child's toy next to it. A chauffeur in a dark uniform stepped out and opened the rear door, and out stepped Monsieur Jean-Pierre Dubois. He was exactly as I had imagined him. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in a suit of such exquisite cut that it made Daniel's expensive business attire look cheap and provincial. He was followed by two other people, a man and a woman, both with the quiet, intense focus of true experts. They radiated an aura of authority and deep specialized knowledge. Daniel stepped out of the studio to intercept them, his face a mask of annoyance. "Excuse me," he said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Can I help you? This is private property." Monsieur Dubois bestowed upon him a smile that was both polite and utterly dismissive. "Mr. Daniel Miller, I presume," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "My apologies for the intrusion." He extended a hand, and Daniel, caught off guard, shook it automatically. "My name is Jean-Pierre Dubois, and I believe our business here is also your business. We are here on behalf of the artist known as Aria. I believe you have her collection in your possession." The name hung in the air, Aria. Daniel stared at him, his mind clearly struggling to make the connection. Henderson, the appraiser, had frozen mid-sentence, his clipboard held limply at his side. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a sudden dawning comprehension. "Aria," Daniel repeated, his voice laced with suspicion. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no one here by that name." "Au contraire," Dubois said, his smile never wavering. He gestured toward the studio. "The artist is no longer with us, tragically, but her work is very much here. We are here at her explicit written request to begin the process of authenticating and securing her estate." He then looked past Daniel, his eyes finding mine in the shadows of the studio. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. The cavalry had arrived. Daniel and the local appraiser were frozen in a state of stunned, confused silence. Monsieur Dubois and his team swept past them and into the studio, their movements a symphony of professional reverence. They did not glance at the work tables or the clay sculptures. Their eyes, the trained, expert eyes of people who lived and breathed fine art, were fixed on the canvases. The woman whose name I later learned was Dr. Alistair Finch, a leading expert on postmodernist painting from Christie's in London, let out a soft, sharp intake of breath. She walked slowly toward the powerful self-portrait of Amelia, her expression one of utter rapt astonishment. "It's real," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's actually real." She and her colleague began to move through the room, putting on white cotton gloves before they touched anything. They lifted the canvases with a care and a tenderness that was a prayer. They spoke to each other in low, excited tones, a rapid-fire exchange of technical observations about brushwork, pigment composition, and thematic resonance. "Look at the impasto on this piece, the sheer confidence of it. The use of light is reminiscent of the late Impressionists, but the emotional core is entirely modern. This is the Lost Silent Soul collection. We've been searching for this for 5 years. The art world thought it was just a rumor." Henderson, the local appraiser, stood by the door, his face having gone from a pasty white to a sickly shade of green. His world of flea market valuations had just collided with a universe he didn't know existed, and the impact had shattered his professional confidence into a million pieces. Daniel was in a state of shock, his brain unable to process the scene unfolding before him. He looked from the reverent experts to the canvases he had dismissed as junk, his expression a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, sickening sense of dread. Finally, Monsieur Dubois, who had been quietly observing, turned to him. His demeanor was still polite, but his voice now carried the weight of an irrefutable verdict. "Mr. Miller," he said, "your mother-in-law, Mrs. Amelia Carter, or as the world will soon know her, the artist Aria, was one of the most important undiscovered talents of the 21st century." He picked up the small painting of the sunflower, the one Mr. Henderson had valued at $100. This small piece, Dubois said, holding it as if it were a precious jewel, is part of her Garden of Light series. The last piece from this series that came to a private auction sold for 1.5 million euros. The number dropped into the silent room like a bomb. Henderson made a small choking sound. Daniel's jaw went slack, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. But Dubois was not finished. He gestured to the powerful, emotional self-portrait. And this piece, the centerpiece of her lost collection, is considered her masterpiece. Our initial conservative estimate for its value at the upcoming London auction would be somewhere in the range of $12 to $15 million. He continued to move through the room, pointing to other canvases, citing figures that were astronomical, incomprehensible. The total value of the clutter in this dusty old garage was not a few $100s. It was a fortune, a vast world-class fortune that would place Amelia in the pantheon of great artists. Daniel's world, the world he had built on a foundation of numbers and market values, had just been utterly and completely annihilated. The asset he had dismissed, the legacy he had mocked, the woman he had underestimated, had just risen from the ashes of his own arrogance and reduced his entire life's work to a fool's errand. He had been playing a game of checkers, and my wife, my quiet, gentle Amelia, had been playing a grandmaster's game of chess. And from beyond the grave she had just declared checkmate. Elena had been standing in the doorway, a silent witness to the entire breathtaking scene. As the reality of what was happening settled in, her expression transformed. The shame and guilt that had haunted her for weeks were washed away by a rising tide of fierce, astonished pride. The mother she had known, the quiet, unassuming woman who found solace in her garden and her canvases, was a giant, a hidden genius whose true worth had been invisible to a world and a husband that lacked the eyes to see. She was not crying now. Her eyes were dry, clear, and blazing with a newfound strength. She turned her gaze on Daniel. He was still standing there, frozen, his face ashen, his mind clearly shattered by the scale of his miscalculation. He looked small, pathetic, a man who had built his entire identity on his ability to assess value and had just failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. "Did you hear that, Daniel?" Elena's voice was quiet, but it cut through the stunned silence of the studio with the clean, sharp edge of a blade. "Did you hear what they said?" He didn't respond. He couldn't. He just stared at the sunflower painting in Monsieur Dubois's hands as if it were a venomous snake. She took a step toward him, her movement no longer hesitant but deliberate, powerful. $100, she said, her voice dripping with a cold, righteous anger. "That's what you saw. That's all you could ever see. You looked at my mother's soul and you put a price tag on it from a flea market." She was not screaming. She was delivering a eulogy for their marriage, for the man she thought she knew. "I stood by and let you do it," she continued, her voice trembling now, not with weakness, but with the force of her own self-loathing. "I listened to your logic and your practicality, Mimo, and I let you convince me that this house was just an asset and her memory was just a liability. I let you turn my grief into a business transaction." She walked over to the self-portrait of Amelia, her hand reaching out to gently, reverently touch the edge of the canvas. "This is my mother," she said, her voice now a whisper filled with a love and a pride that was so profound it was heartbreaking. "This is her strength. This is her fire. This is the woman you were never ever capable of seeing." She turned back to him, her eyes finally locking with his. "This is her real value, a value you could never calculate, a legacy you tried to demolish." And with that, she turned her back on him, a simple final act of severance. She walked over to me, to her father, and for the first time in a month, she took my hand. It was a choice, a definitive alignment. And in that moment, I knew that Amelia's plan had not just been about saving me or saving her art. It had been about saving our daughter. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, swift, and total collapse. Daniel's world did not end with a bang, but with the rustle of papers and the cold, final click of a lawyer's briefcase. In a brief, sterile meeting the following week, Monsieur Dubois, acting as the executor of Amelia's artistic estate, presented the ironclad legal documents she had prepared. The emergency petition Daniel had filed was rendered void. All claims he had made against me were dismissed. The legal fortress he had built with his lies was washed away by the simple, irrefutable truth of my wife's foresight. He was left with nothing but the crippling debt he had accrued in anticipation of a fortune that was never his to claim. Worse, he now faced the very real threat of lawsuits for attempted fraud and financial elder abuse. His professional reputation was shattered, his future a barren wasteland of his own making. Elena left him that same week. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful goodbye. She simply packed a single suitcase and came home. The home her husband had tried to steal from her father. She told me later that she looked at him across their perfect minimalist living room and realized she was looking at a complete stranger, a man whose soul was a spreadsheet of profit and loss, a man who would never understand the value of a single, imperfect, beautiful thing. Their divorce was quiet and quick. He did not contest it. There was nothing left to fight for. A few months later, the house was no longer silent. It was alive. With the help of Elena and Monsieur Dubois, I transformed the studio. It was no longer a dusty shed, but a clean, bright space, a small gallery dedicated to the work of Amelia Aria Carter. We did not sell her masterpieces. Instead, we used the vast resources her legacy provided to establish a foundation in her name. The Aria Foundation, dedicated to supporting talented and struggling female artists who, like her, worked in the quiet shadows of the world. The house that Daniel had tried to empty was now filled with the sound of laughter, of debate, of creation. Young artists came from all over to see her work, to learn from her story, to find inspiration in her quiet, unyielding strength. The rooms that had once echoed with my grief now echoed with the vibrant pulse of a new beginning. One late afternoon, as the golden light of sunset streamed through the studio's skylight, Elena and I stood before the one painting we had chosen to hang in the main house. It was a self-portrait I had never seen before, one she must have painted in her final months. She looked directly out from the canvas, her expression a mix of gentle, knowing wisdom and an indomitable, steely resolve. Her eyes, the same deep, thoughtful eyes as our daughters, seemed to follow us, to see us, to know us. "She knew, didn't she, Dad?" Elena asked, her voice a soft whisper. She knew all of this was going to happen. I reached out and took my daughter's hand, our fingers lacing together. A sense of peace so profound and so complete that it felt like a benediction settled over me. "Yes," I said, a small smile touching my lips. "She knew. Your mother didn't just paint pictures, sweetheart. She painted our future." Her true legacy was not in the astronomical figures cited by the auction houses, nor in the legal documents that bore her name. It was here in the light-filled rooms of our home, in the hope she had given to a new generation of artists, in the daughter she had saved, and in the quiet, unshakable strength she had given me to see it all through. Her legacy was the beautiful, undeniable truth that love, when it is real, is the most powerful asset of all. It is a masterpiece that can never be sold, never be devalued, and will continue to protect the ones you love long after you are gone.